Even more developing news tonight on Bob Mueller's Russia investigation. New York's top prosecutor working with Mueller on the Paul Manafort angle, while Mueller is now pressuring Manafort's family and his lawyer, who drew an unusual subpoena from Mueller, according to a Wall Street Journal report. Tonight, there are signs that Trump's lawyers, though, are pushing back. They want to change the topic from these stories about Russians in the grand jury room, about Manafort's struggles, to a new topic. They want to debate Jim Comey, and they're leaking their opinion that Trump had the power to fire Comey and that it had nothing to do with obstruction. Now, Mueller's team will certainly assess those defenses. They're going to read anything that Trump's lawyers send over, but they're not backing an inch off the pressure on Manafort. In fact, Mueller's tapped prosecutor Andrew Weissman, who is known for his probing investigations and flipping witnesses in the famous Enron case. That was the complex fraud case. Another key prosecutor on that team, who you just met moments ago on the beat, Kathy Rumler, once recounted how Weissman is willing to take risks to secure witness testimony that other prosecutors might not. Rumler helped secure the Enron convictions and went on to serve as White House counsel to President Obama. You can see her there. The former president, a talented lawyer himself, said that he picked Rumler as his top lawyer because she, quote, had an uncanny ability to see around corners that no one else anticipates. Back with us is that lawyer, Kathy Rumler. Appreciate you being here on such a busy night. Let me ask you, since Barack Obama thought you had this skill, and I believe him, your old boss, what corners do you think Mueller is looking around now?
Well, that's a great question. And let me just say at the outset that I have absolutely no information at all about what evidence they've actually collected and, what they're really looking at other than what I've read in the papers. So, my observations and opinions here are really based solely on publicly available information and knowing a number of the players involved. So I'll say that at the outset.
It's a modest way of saying, while you don't have any secret grand jury material, you're drawing on your experience overseeing 45 lawyers in the White House working for a president. I get it.
Yeah. So, look, I think that what you have embodied in the special counsel team, led by Bob Mueller, is just an extraordinary amount of experience. And probably more experience, within a single team or group of prosecutors than we've seen in recent history, working on a single matter. The breadth of cases that they have investigated and prosecuted over many years is really unparalleled. And so it's that experience that allows somebody to really see around corners, to anticipate the types of defenses, the types of legal challenges that might be brought against investigative actions that they're taking, but also, to really understand how people who are trying to conceal potential misconduct go about doing it. You couldn't have, just a greater wealth of experience than this team has.
And then you look at these leaks to the Wall Street Journal, which, to my legal eyes, didn't have anything really new in them. I mean, people are going to be hearing about this tonight and tomorrow. It was basically a leak saying that Trump's lawyers think that he has the power to fire Comey. They've met with Mueller in recent months, submitted memos arguing that the president has that power, basically, that he didn't obstruct justice. And they also question Comey's reliability, which is standard operating procedure. What I don't see here in the report is anything new or even necessarily newsworthy, other than that it's coming from them. And then I'll decode this for, but, they then say to the Journal, oh, we have no comment. We'd never comment on anything with the leaks of their memos. So obviously, they either lost them in a park in Washington or they gave them to the Wall Street Journal. Your view of that part of the strategy, because my understanding, yours being far more important, but my understanding is the question isn't whether you have the authority to fire Comey. That's not in doubt. The question is whether you abuse the authority to fire him in a manner that might obstruct or impede justice under federal law.
That's right. The motive, the why was he fired, is incredibly important here. And, that's what, in part, I think what the special counsel will be investigating and looking at. So the fact that he had the inherent legal authority is relevant, but it's not dispositive.
Right. Well, let me turn to the other piece I initially invited you on to discuss, which is we've been mentioning Mueller and the Attorney General of New York looking into the financial transactions. Paul Manafort having received $40 million from this Russian oligarch over several years, and we're going to show you how to follow the money. $12.7 million from political work in Ukraine over 2 years. Since then, Manafort, then you see there in New York, purchases 4 properties, 3 of them in cash. And he purchases a mansion down there in Florida. Now, some of those properties bought under shadow companies linked to Manafort, which then transferred the properties back to him for a $0 transaction. Manafort also reportedly taking out loans on several of those properties, which can look odd if you are flush enough to have originally bought them in cash. Looks like he may be facing legal jeopardy. A former prosecutor in the Illinois U.S. Attorney's Office saying, quote, "If I represented Paul Manafort, I would conclude my client has significant criminal liability." And this is an area where the liability may be for both the federal and the state crimes, money laundering being a key example. So walk us through this, Kathy. If Manafort is being pushed on all of this, and then he puts down a card and says, well, I have a get out of jail free card from the president. I think I can get it. And now what seems to be new today is these investigators pushing back and saying, well, here's another card. You could go to jail in New York. It could be even tougher. And then the question is, what card does Manafort's legal team play after that?
Right. Well, we don't know exactly what cards are being played, but it's a pretty weak card to play with the prosecutor, is that I might get a presidential pardon in the future. And I know there's been a lot of speculation that, President Trump was sending a signal to everybody in the Russia probe with the Arpaio pardon that, he was going to hand out pardons like, trick-or-treat candy on Halloween. But if from a prosecutor's perspective, if someone comes in and says that, that's just really not an enormous amount of leverage. And, I'm so glad that you said follow the money, because what the prosecution team and investigation team is really going to be doing in significant part is following the money. That's how you investigate these cases. And, asymmetry of information is the power that the special counsel and the prosecutors have. Paul Manafort or any other individual who's caught up in this probe, they have no idea what evidence that the special counsel has gathered. And so, they're in a way, they're sort of flying a little blind. And that's really where the true power comes from, and the leverage and the ability to, to get a witness to sort of come to the table and tell the truth and come clean. And that's really the goal.
Well, you make such an interesting point, what you're calling the asymmetry of information, right? I mean, in newsrooms, we're just learning who was brought before the grand jury secretly weeks ago. It's new because it's newly revealed, but it was weeks ago that this first individual, a Russian lobbyist, went into the grand jury room to talk about that meeting. We don't know over the next 2 weeks, and as to your point, Paul Manafort's lawyers and he probably don't know what other people from that meeting went in. And you usually don't want to be the last one in, the 7th or 8th person talked to about it. But as you say, it's asymmetrical. What I want to ask you about is to build on that point and also put it in the context of the money. I'm going to put up on the screen again for viewers' benefit these shell companies linked to Manafort. You've got the purchase of a Trump Tower apartment. That's how he got to know Trump initially, all the way back in 06, $3.6 million. New York condo in 07, $2.5 million. Florida mansion, $1.5 million in 07. A few years later, a New York City loft for $2.85 million, also a cash purchase, as I mentioned. And then in 2012, a Brooklyn brownstone for about $3 million in cash. And who wouldn't want a $3 million brownstone in Brooklyn? It's a great thing. A lot of properties. How do investigators look at this and say, okay, are you just a super successful businessman who puts a lot of money down in cash, or do you expose yourself to criminal liability for money laundering?
You might. I mean, it certainly raises a lot of red flags, right? Which is making these big purchases with cash. It might be completely legitimate, but it might not. And so as a prosecutor, what you'd want to say is, okay, well, where did that money come from? That's really the key question. And so that's why when we talk about following the money, you want to trace it back. Where did it come from? And, people don't usually just carry around, $3.65 million in cash. It's somewhere in a bank. And how did it get into that bank? And what was the originating bank? And so,
yeah, I don't think Scrooge McDuck had $3.5 million in coin. I mean, that's a lot of money for cash.
That's exactly right. It's a lot of money for cash, although, people do, particularly in Manhattan, people do, make large purchases of real estate, as you know, Ari, with cash. But nevertheless, these are, questions that you'd want to ask and you'd want to know. And there are probably a whole lot of bank records that give you, a very substantial trail about where the money originated from. And when you're talking about money laundering, what gives rise to a money laundering violation is if the money came from, particular types of what the statute says, unlawful specified activity. So if there's an underlying, criminal activity.
Right.
That you engaged in, and then you tried to conceal it through, putting the proceeds of that into a real estate deal, into a condo or something, then that's a separate offense, separate and apart from whatever, whether it was a narcotics deal where you got, $5 million from selling however many kilos of cocaine, and then you try to put it into an apartment in order to conceal the source of those funds. That's a separate offense of money laundering.
Right, and that's where you get the crimes, stacking up, to your point. As
Exactly.
a former federal prosecutor who worked under Mueller's Enron task force on complex fraud, and as a former counselor to President Obama, we are very lucky to have a lot of your expertise tonight, Kathy Mueller. Thank you.
It was great to be here. Thanks, Ari.
That other prosecutors might not. Mueller helped secure the Enron convictions and went on to serve as White House counsel to President Obama. You can see her there. The former president, a talented lawyer himself, said that he picked Mueller as his top lawyer because she, quote, had an uncanny ability to see around corners that no one else anticipates. In fact, Mueller's tapped prosecutor Andrew Weissman, who is known for his probing investigations and flipping witnesses in the famous Enron case. That was the complex fraud case. Another key prosecutor on that team, who you just met moments ago on the beat, Kathy Mueller, once recounted how Weissman is willing to take risks to secure witness testimony about Russians in the grand jury room, about Manafort's struggles, to a new topic. They want to debate Jim Comey, and they're leaking their opinion that Trump had the power to fire Comey and that it had nothing to do with obstruction. Now, Mueller's team will certainly assess those defenses. They're going to read anything that Trump's lawyers send over, but they're not backing an inch off the pressure on Manafort. Back with us is that lawyer, Kathy Mueller. Appreciate you being here on such a busy night. Let me ask you, since Barack Obama thought you had this skill, and I believe him, your old boss, what corners do you think Mueller is looking around now?
Well, that's a great question. And let me just say at the outset that I have absolutely no information at all.
Even more developing news tonight on Bob Mueller's Russia investigation. New York's top prosecutor working with Mueller on the Paul Manafort angle, while Mueller is now pressuring Manafort's family and his lawyer, who drew an unusual subpoena from Mueller, according to a Wall Street Journal report. Tonight, there are signs that Trump's lawyers, though, are pushing back. They want to change the topic from these stories